what we're starting to see now in the market is more operators actually understanding that they're actually a super user of energy. So we've got a couple of customers now signed up with us in the bus space where they're making their charging load available for grid services schemes. So they're actually starting to connect the dots in some cases now and becoming a lot more advanced in understanding that they are a virtual power plant.
Welcome to In Between Charges, the perfect podcast to listen to while waiting for your EV to charge. I'm Kevin Spangenberg, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Mike Hawks. Mike, is the Copenhagen summer living up to your expectations?
I think we haven't had the Copenhagen summer yet, so I'm holding in for that it's going to start tomorrow.
That sounds like it's actually meeting expectations then. Because a Copenhagen summer is always waiting for it to arrive.
But Michael, you and I, we're from England. We're very used to this. This is the standard. There's no such thing as bad weather. It's bad clothing.
Yeah, we've had a similar experience this summer, or you can't even call it a summer. So we feel your pain over here.
I keep hearing about these heat waves across Europe. That wave has not crested in Denmark. It just stops about Berlin. Today, for this final episode of Season 1 of In Between Charges, we are coming back to the grid. The biggest machine man has ever made, and how technology platforms and software are helping to drive modernization in the transition to net zero. To do so, we are joined by Michael Kent from GridBeyond, a leading technology platform that bridges the gap between distributed energy resources and electricity markets to connect assets such as renewables and batteries and vehicles to ultimately unlock flexibility and to participate in various energy services. Michael is the head of EV solutions at GridBeyond and is responsible for the growth, strategy, and deployment of EV-related solutions from connections to charging infrastructure, aggregation, energy market access. The list goes on. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here today.
First off, congrats on the new role. That's exciting. I know you just announced that a little bit earlier this week. That's very exciting, and it's great to be speaking with someone who's also working directly in the EV space. But let's begin with the grid. I think that's an appropriate place to start for GridBeyond. Sort of starts right there in the name. Could you provide a description of what your company is doing and what grid services means? Why is this such an interesting and dynamic place at the moment versus the past when the electric grid was probably not an area we considered to be very lively and maybe a little bit the opposite of dynamic?
Yeah, good to be here today. Thanks for the invite. So GridBeyond, we're essentially a flexibility provider. So we're based in the UK and Ireland, the US, Australia and Japan. Our core business is connecting any electricity assets and entering them into what's called grid services schemes. Each country or each jurisdiction has a mandate to keep the grid within a certain frequency. So we approach businesses or businesses approach us, and they make their energy assets available for a range of different schemes. So our core background has been in cold stores, refrigeration, furnaces. But now as we're seeing more EVs enter the grid, it gives particularly customers, fleet operators, opportunities to enter those assets in as flexible assets as well. We also are involved in renewables, like you say, and also battery storage. So you see these big battery storage projects going up. They'll have an investor name behind them, but actually the science underneath it is done by a company like ourselves. So through AI optimization, 24/7 trading, and so on and so forth.
And is this kind of take a similar form from market to market, or will it really depend in each country or market what types of solutions you can offer or which types of solutions companies prefer?
It's quite similar, the concept in each market. So if you take it right back to its raw form, we'll be looking at what types of assets they have on site, what load they can make flexible from those assets, and what the right programs are for them. We use EV as an example because that's my space, of course. We tend to recommend what you'd call a slower service. And what I mean by a slower service is entering those charging assets into a scheme which is a bit lower down against the grid, so one of the last lines of defense, and making those chargers available for a short period of time. In other schemes, they're what's called faster services, and that's where your batteries may fall into because they're more available. They can react quicker in most cases. So we really handhold the customer, if you like, to say, okay, guys, you've got a decent size load. What types of assets have you got on site? What does your operation look like too? and how can we fit the best scheme that suits your needs, but also gives you that secondary revenue stream that you might be looking for as a result.
Is it fair to say that GridBeyond is playing a role in trying to help the grid rebalance itself and maintain stability and reliability as it's essentially going through these changes? And essentially, you're entering new assets into the market that, as of yet, they're very new. And the market's obviously not designed for things like renewables, and it's not designed for things like batteries. Are your customers predominantly grid operators, or are they businesses who basically want to participate in that?
That's exactly what we're doing, but we're mainly a B2B based business. So we're approaching industrial customers, EV partners, battery storage investors. However, we're engaged with the grids. We have to be, because it's a regulated market.
Maybe it's a simple question, maybe it's a little more complex, but on these B2B offerings, what are the businesses paying you for? Is it a fee-based, a usage-based model? And then is it contract-based on, okay, we send X amount of energy, we receive Y amount of fees, et cetera? How does that work?
We don't generally charge fees, as crazy as it sounds. We pay the customers. So the way it would work is, in some cases, we're using software to connect the assets into the relevant schemes. We're acting as the agent where we register those assets. We bid in the amount of volume that we think that customer can achieve through flexibility. And we pull the money down from the national grid schemes, and then we share that back to the customers at the other end. So sometimes it can be quite an interesting conversation to say, how much does it cost? And generally we're saying nothing. There is sometimes small cost if we need to install a frequency reader at their business. But yeah, we're generally on a revenue share basis with the end customers. We look for anywhere from 3 years upwards with customers, because we have to bid in volumes on an ongoing rolling basis. So with certain customers, it's getting a view of their load today to bid into a future market. And the reason that's there is so the grid understands what they've got available and if they need to take any other action for increasing the volume of flexibility. And that's linked back to the path to net zero. With EVs coming on board, that's going to add potential stress onto the grid. So at the moment, we're seeing a lot of noise in flexibility services. There's a lot more interest in them. The incentive for the customer is revenue based. But for other customers, there's this whole path to net zero sustainability, which grid services can play a part in as well.
Fantastic. You mentioned a key word there that I'd quite like to spend a bit of time just understanding a little bit more, and that's demand response. It's a topic that's come up also a few times in previous episodes, and something also that we believe is very crucial now to this kind of next stage of modernization of the grid, but also adding additional incentives for businesses, for individuals to basically participate and electrify. And I was listening to a podcast on the way in this morning in between rain clouds, and they were mentioning quite a good analogy, which is, now that we're trying to go through big changes of the grid, it's almost like trying to rebuild an airplane whilst it's already in the air. And it comes back to the 3Ds: decarbonization, decentralization, and then also digitization. So could you maybe just explain a little bit for us what you mean by demand response, and why is it so important to have that as part of our, climate fighting toolbox in this journey to net zero?
So demand response is essentially energy assets being responsive when there's a demand or a stress event on the grid. The 3Ds that you mentioned, we're playing a key part in that because we've invested a lot of software implementation, AI, and that's capturing multiple assets through a digitalized platform to make them available for the grid schemes. There's a real focus in certain geographies to be able to have demand response assets available to help balance that profile of energy use that's going on throughout the day. We're controlling those assets to be able to ensure that those lights stay on. And as the grid is being upgraded, that's going to be absolutely crucial because there's a lot more electricity assets being made live on the grid. That could be an EV charger, that could be a heat pump, for example, as well.
Then just kind of playing on that, what's the doomsday scenario here? If companies like GridBeyond didn't exist, and if software aggregators like your company didn't exist, what do we think would actually happen?
Well, in some cases, there'd be a huge stress event on the grid and the lights would go out. Your electricity simply wouldn't work. So it's a real important part of the ecosystem. And it's a really interesting space because it's getting a lot more noise from politicians, government about the importance of demand response when it comes to help stabilizing the grid.
You mentioned a couple of minutes ago that the increased strain on the grid, and we know that grids everywhere are coming under new pressure given the amount of connected assets. That's not only electric vehicles, that's new batteries, solar panels, so many buildings being built. But we know that building new sources of energy is not going fast enough. But we also know that software has a key role to play in that as well. So do you feel like software alone, a solution such as GridBeyond, is enough to figure out new ways of balancing and incorporating new sources of energy? Or is it kind of a both and when it comes to the permitting piece that we need that software to balance and distribute new sources of energy, as well as all these bringing on board and bringing online so many new batteries, solar panels, wind farms, et cetera?
I think it depends on the situation because our software platform does optimize and predict and forecast. So it actually can show a potential customer or a land developer, residential builder, if I do X, Y, and Z with solar, battery, etc., what will that mean in terms of the potential consumption, the generation, the CO2 reductions? There is a little bit in between there where I think the physical element is still going to remain important. Infrastructure out on the ground, transformers, switchgear, substation upgrades, ensuring that can be built out almost like a spider leg effect where it's actually more integrated. The third piece, definitely software comes in. So we've invested a huge amount in software where we can control assets on a remote basis. So we'll take EVs as an example. That's a really, really good example. We've developed a solution where we can ultimately aggregate small amounts of charges. They might be at people's homes. They might be on the roadside. They might be, in various locations at a fleet depot. We can bring those together as one asset and we can make those available for the demand response schemes. So the way that we do that is through APIs and working with partners who manage charging stations. So I think there's a bit of both, but certainly from more assets going on the grid, it's a no-brainer. Your software is a crucial part of ensuring you can make those assets flexible at the right time, quickly, to be able to take action and ultimately help balance the grid and drive those revenues that some customers are looking for.
This is where both GridBeyond and Monta are working closely together through Powerbank to be able to provide that kind of partnership service out. We're talking about individual EVs, but then also there are heavy duty vehicles, other types of fleets that are going to be charging at a much higher capacity and a much higher kilowatt rate.
We don't want those big buses or delivery vans to go to waste when they're sitting there at the depot overnight, right?
It's really interesting you bring that up because we're starting to see stage 2 of particularly bus and large fleets transition to EV. So stage 1, I would explain that as, right, we've got a mandate to convert to electric. What do we need to do? So stage 1, they were looking at grid connections, vehicle, chargers and software. What we're starting to see now in the market is more operators actually understanding that they're actually a super user of energy. So we've got a couple of customers now signed up with us in the bus space where they're making their charging load available for grid services schemes. So they're actually starting to connect the dots in some cases now and becoming a lot more advanced in understanding that they are a virtual power plant.
Can you keep talking us through it? So stage 1, we're basically getting ready with the mandate. Stage 2, there are businesses now who are essentially investing and looking for these services. So it creates the demand to build them out. What's happening next? I mean, what does stage 3, 4, 5 look like?
Well, some customers are starting to think about things like battery storage at their sites, B2B charging at their depots as well, when you're talking fleet operators. So a lot of these larger companies that we're talking about here have invested quite heavily in, we will be zero emission by 2035, and they've got mandates to reduce their CO2 footprint as a result of those plans that they've implemented. It's again in early stages in some cases, but where we're coming from when we talk to these customers, if it's the cost as the challenge, we sort of say, well, actually, if you did this and you brought in 20 EVs over here, you could actually make those 20 EV charging stations available for grid services schemes. So your total cost of ownership actually is reduced over the period of time. And then when you start to show those elements to a customer, it becomes more real. And that's where we're coming in to say, well, actually, if you look at it this way, it can mean this. And actually, your CO2 and your sustainability targets are being further advanced as a result of doing some of these schemes.
Just to kind of add on, so the stage is kind of progressing throughout the modes of transportation and the different battery sizes and power output needs, but then also charger types. But the stages are also about maturity and investment of businesses in really doubling down in electrification. That means we're kind of moving out of this early adopter phase more into the actual mainstream. This is something that people can really clearly see a return on investment, whether it is a monetary return on investment or whether it is something related to, I don't know, how well they can attract employees, for example, because they're participating in this transition basically, and support also people who are already using and driving an EV.
Yeah.
Many of these maybe fleet owners, depot owners, they're not used to these types of business opportunities, these new models, and they just think about, oh, it's this upfront cost. They think that's the sticker price and that's what they got to pay. And they see this high number and they're a little intimidated, maybe a little bit scared. Could you discuss how a lot of your job can be educating customers about these new opportunities, both, on a B2B level, but also maybe the normal everyday consumer?
So when we go into conversations with customers, we're really diving deep in terms of where you at with your net zero transition. We do tend to find some gaps from our side. It could be the way that they are purchasing their energy, their focus on renewables and what's been done there, or lack of it in some cases. Or it could simply be, hey guys, you're not doing demand response services with your increased load. So we get quite deep into it, but it's actually not that difficult to do. It's obtaining either existing or forecasted half-hourly data consumption. That's the starting point with a customer to say, well, okay, you're using an average load of a megawatt right now. You've got 20 vehicles in your fleet depot. We can build a story and a picture up quite comprehensively. So we have a team that models all of the markets and insights. So we tend to show them a 10-year rolling forecast of what it might mean as a result of doing X, Y, and Z.
Is a big piece of it trying to communicate how easy it is or low touch it is? Because I was just reading a little bit about the UK in preparation for this episode, and there's like maybe a little bit of a softening of some stances from some political leaders. And like Rishi Sunak said, we're going to hit our targets, but we also don't want to hassle people's lives. We want to make the change, but we don't want it to put us out too much. So as part of the challenge is communicating, it's going to be easy, it's going to be low touch, you're going to make a little bit of money, and you're going to help out the grid.
We've learned this over the last 6 to 8 months since I've been here. The industry can be very technical. So what we've done as part of our communication with customers is layman's terms, i.e., here's what you're doing at your site. Here's what it means. And this is how many times the events will happen. And here's what you need to do to be able to open up these markets through GridBeyond. It can be very technical. There's a lot of acronyms, so we understand what they are. But the average person who's fairly well educated in EV fleet operations, let's say, might not have a clue because they're going through that transition.
Are you succeeding at that?
Yes, I've been in the role for 8 months with GridBeyond, but we're in the EV space. We've now got 7 separate customers in EV across various programs. Some of them are demand response, some of them are via a PPA, power purchase agreement, and some of them are on battery storage projects. So the message is getting through, but there's still always that challenge of sometimes it sounds too good to be true. So we've got to break that barrier down. When they see their competitors doing it, or another EV fleet company doing it, or another EV software company doing it, that's when the dominoes tend to roll and fall.
So the UK, at the moment, as we know, very ambitious combustion engine phase-out plans within Europe. And 2030 is when we want to have 100% EV sales. And I think, maybe it's related to Rishi Sunak's comment that you've mentioned, Kevin, as well. But we know that we're starting to wobble a little bit about that. So could you maybe just talk a little bit about how the sentiment is within the climate tech community within the UK? And do you feel like now that you're in stage 2, this momentum is actually building, or are you finding you're coming across more pushback and more barriers when you're trying to work with these businesses?
I think it depends in what sector you're talking to. The consumers, when they've transitioned to EV, they're generally bought into it. I think the challenge with that space is, of course, the current price of an EV. Let's be honest, it's not affordable right now. But of course, the second-hand market will grow and evolve. Some of the larger fleet customers, if they've been mandated or if they've been given some grant money to help electrify, they're already on that journey and that they can see the value in it. Of course, with the political landscape, we're coming up to an election next year in the UK. And I think a lot of the noise that we see is linked to the London and the expansion of the low emissions zone, because it played a key part in one of the by-elections down there. From our side, we're still very positive about it. There's more work to be done in certain sectors, coach, larger vans, trucks. And I suppose until you see more mandated action taking place, nobody will really move unless they're a bit more forward thinking and unless they've got the sustainable targets in place to be zero emission by date X and Y.
There are a few things that would contribute to that. One thing is consumer needs. The other thing is trying to set up and manage a grid which is on a small island, which is a relative difficulty in comparison to being in the mainland in Europe. There's one capability that gets talked about a lot in our industry at the moment, and quite rightly, because it will play a role in trying to connect the car correctly into not just the grid, but also the home. And I guess I've already started to allude it just through that sentence, but vehicle to grid, this is something that gets talked about quite a lot. I don't think it's yet really properly understood what vehicle to grid actually is and what it means, and also how mature we are with it, because the battery in a vehicle itself can be connected to various different appliances and various different assets. It's really kind of vehicle to X. And at the moment, we're in this stage of vehicle to home, really. So can you just maybe talk to us a little bit more about what vehicle to grid specifically means? Like, how critical is it to the future energy and grid security? And what are some of the blockers maybe that means it's not yet a reality today?
Yeah, you're essentially using your vehicle battery to help balance the grid. So in the event of a stress event on the grid, what you're essentially doing is connecting your vehicle battery through a V2G charger to then help balance the grid through a battery on the car. We are early stages. There's a huge amount of noise. I'm going to be unshameable and plug that we've been successful for 2 projects for V2G in the UK, which are starting in October. Thank you. So we will be doing some trials with partners over V2G technology, and it's B2B, but using fleets and all the rest of it. So the challenge in this market is how you can optimize the batteries on a smaller scale, what technology you need from a charging infrastructure point of view. And I think the thing that we've seen from vehicle to grid is what downtime the vehicles have to be able to enter those various markets. The other elephant in the room with V2G is having the balance between the warranty on the battery and being made against what the cycles that it needs to undertake per day. So that's something that comes up as a blocker. I think there's definitely a part to play. In my personal opinion, I think it's more of a residential piece and fleets that have got long dwell time, maybe coaches, for example. So I think what residential customers will have the ability to do is use their vehicle battery to either enter that into a grid service scheme or simply use it to power their home. So similar to what we see with a solar and battery at someone's house. So you're not pulling from the grid, you're actually using your vehicle to help support the house. In America, there's a lot of noise, particularly in California, on V2G right now, and they're talking about mandating it from 2027.
But you still need kind of all the 3, I guess, phases to kind of fit together. You need a vehicle that can do V2G, and most of them, as far as I'm aware, are not capable of doing that. Tesla can't even do it. Then you need the charger able to do it. You need the vehicle charger able to bidirectional charging, right? And then you need either the battery or the grid able to accept it, right? So you kind of need all those pieces to fit together. And in most cases, we're not quite, you have a couple of pilots and that's great, but in most residential cases, we don't have all those pieces that fit together just yet, right?
No, yeah, that's correct. It was interesting because we had a meeting with a car manufacturer last month, and they are heavily looking at how they develop their vehicles to be able to be V2G enabled from a battery technology point of view. I talked earlier about the stage of EV transition. We're right at the start in the UK market. And we'll see what happens with our projects that we've been successful on and see what the learnings are from that.
I'm just curious, what did that manufacturer, what was their point of view on it? Were they kind of like, well, we'd like to do this, but also can we figure out how we get a cut of this? Is there any way we can get involved with this?
I think so, yeah. And I think the other part of it is how can they make their batteries more circular economy led as well. So they're thinking about when the battery's in the vehicle, but what happens to that battery when it comes out of the vehicle? They can be utilized for storage and put into various markets to help balance the grid. So they're coming out from both angles, because the last thing we want is vehicle batteries being thrown into landfill.
Definitely. From my point of view, there will be this consumer hurdle to get over as well, which is how reliable a battery is. There's perception at the moment that if you're charging it to 100%, then you're going to really quickly degrade that. If we're doing bidirectional charging, does it increase the actual risk of fire of a battery or something like this?
Yeah, there's already companies who are insuring those second life batteries as a business model. We were in a conversation with a bus customer the other day, and they've had EVs for a number of years, and they're not seeing the degradation of the batteries as high as they expected. No matter what you see in the press about a fire, don't always believe everything it's said. It's more of a human error in most cases. But they were really positive about how well the batteries were lasting and not degrading at the levels they expected. And these are quite heavy routes that they're operating.
Yeah, they're buses that are used hour by hour, day by day, accelerated braking, real kind of heavy loads that they're carrying around. They are being really kind of used end to end.
And we're back on software here, but it can actually help consumers or drivers understand what's going on with our battery. So there's companies now that can manage the battery performance and the state of charge, state of health, stress levels on the batteries. A lot of companies are also doing that side of things as well to ensure that that asset is being maximized.
And that's actually interesting you mentioned. We're going to interview someone from Sphere Energy, which is one of these battery development companies providing advisory services in the next few episodes as well. So we'll get into this in more detail. All right. Where are we going next?
Across the pond?
We're going big old distance over to the west.
Well, he brought it up. I'm not doing it.
And I'll try my best.
Oh, but what is GridBeyond doing in America? Obviously, beyond the size of the market, what is attractive about America, and how is the grid set up there? Either easier or more difficult to navigate? And what are you encountering in America?
Yeah, so we've been in America now for 3 years. We're across 5 states at the moment. What I would say in a nutshell is they are like 5 separate countries in themselves. From a regulation program point of view, demand side response, and then from a utility level, is what it's called over there. So essentially a network operator level. So we're seeing consumer-driven regulation as a result of further EV sales. But there's a lot of software noises in that country. So our software solution is hitting the mark, particularly from a forecasting optimization point of view in customers that are looking at transitioning to EV or net zero. So we're doing a lot in that space at the moment. Demand side response is an interesting one. And in my space, EV in particular, school buses are a really interesting area because they are really, really key assets that you can do V2G with, for example. But again, we're not quite there with those things with the customer.
So are there quite a few more opportunities in California due to the consumer preferences there?
Yeah, essentially. The message I would give, and we talk about internally, is follow where the load is on EV. And when I mean the load, is where essentially where's the most chargers, where's the most vehicles. And over there, there's a lot more EV fleets in operation, as an example.
Follow where the load is or follow where the load will be, because then there's also a big part of getting set up to begin with in these states that are much more stage 1, stage 2, greenfield type site. But I really like that phrase. Maybe just out of interest, Michael, what 5 states did you choose as GridBeyond?
CAISO, PGM, ERCOT, and it's not America, is it? It's Ontario, Canada as well. And yeah. So actually up there, Texas as well.
And Texas.
Yeah.
That's ERCOT.
And that's ERCOT, yeah. So essentially the reason for those is the markets are easier to enter from a regulation point of view. And there's a lot more going in terms of like EV in California and so on and so forth. So there's a bit of a double-edged sword. We've looked at it from a regulation point of view as well as a market transition.
So to wrap up, I kind of want to discuss collaboration. Obviously, Monta and GridBeyond are entering into what we hope is a very fruitful collaboration in the UK. But we see a lot of B2B relationships that are developing. How do you kind of see this collaboration space developing going forward as everybody, right? Your business model, we have our model, we're trying to get connected assets. Some people are trying to manage the energy flows and everything. It opens up a lot of collaboration opportunities, but it also, that means there's a potential for friction. So as we're all trying to get a little slice of this pie, of this big energy transition pie, what's your take on how you see that kind of going forward?
Whenever I talk to a customer, I'll phrase it this way. If a company comes to you and says, we can do everything, never believe them in the energy transition, because they can't. And in this sector, there's specialist companies. So from our side, partnerships are absolutely crucial, because stage one might be one of those suppliers that's supplying the charging and the infrastructure. What we're doing is we're actually engaging with those types of companies, as well as the likes of Monta, for the software, to say, hey, look, we can bring a different angle to the customer's end goal here, and we can really add value. So we're embarking on a few fleet projects like that with partners right now. So partnerships are key. It can cause friction. Of course it can. But the companies who say, we will do everything, they will definitely be missing parts of their offer, because over time, customers will become more educated. And if you're not in that space of being able to accept partners to offer a full, wider, broader solution, you may end up losing long term.
Completely agree. I think it's already such a fragmented industry in all of the different use cases for people wanting to charge their vehicle, let alone then being able to suddenly participate in a new market that they might not have ever heard before as a business or as an individual. And I think it's only possible through individual partnerships.
The partners that we're working with, it's very open as well. So for the customer, they see who they're working with. If you look at the presentations or you're in a meeting, we'll go to meetings together, for example. It won't be one company fronting it with hidden elements behind. So I think the openness with consumers and customers is key. And it's an ecosystem that we're in. We are specialists in scheduling assets, and we know how to make money from those energy assets. But we're not an EV software company. We don't do what Monta does. So if we didn't work together, we couldn't open up more opportunities in these markets, which is ultimately the main benefit is the customer. That's what we're there for.
Very nice. We'd like to also close with a question that we ask all of our guests as part of the podcast. We've talked a lot today about grid connections, relationships between specialist individuals and companies, differences between markets. And with all of that, it comes a lot of myths that seems to be heralded as truths and very quickly taken up by individuals or companies as well. But if you were to bust one myth in the EV industry or in the EV charging industry or related to grid and software providers, what would it be?
I'm probably going to be on the borderline of the consumer here, because there can be a lot of negativity in the press around an EV, not all press, but certain press, is the...
very democratic of you.
Yeah, it's a wide-ranging myth, right? It's the fear of transitioning to EV. There's absolutely nothing to be frightened of. Your vehicle's not going to blow up. The range is getting better, and the technology is advancing quickly. So the biggest myth, don't be scared, because there's nothing to be scared of. So it's not so much of a myth, it's a barrier. So let's break down those barriers.
I love it. Fantastic.
EVs, not here to hassle your lives.
Yeah.
Michael, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Yeah. Was that useful for you?
That was brilliant.
So, Mike, that does it for season 1 of In Between Charges.
That does it. That's 10 episodes of listening to each other's voices and also the voices of our guests. And more often than not, hopefully, they've been very interesting conversations as well for the audience.
I've found them interesting. I'm biased. I work in this. I love this stuff, but I think the conversations have been fantastic. We've found excellent guests across our industry, but from like adjacent kind of companies and sectors. And I just thought they provided such great insight. And I learned quite a bit from all of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And so massive thank you to all of our guests who participated on the show and shared their experience and insights. We really appreciate you taking the time to share that with us. And also to all of our listeners, thanks also for tuning in. And we hope that you found it useful and also given you a bit of a distraction when you are actually standing there charging, whether it's raining, you're inside the car, where it's a beautiful day and you're able to enjoy the view on your journey, on your road to somewhere. So this is the end of Series 1. We'll be back next month, beginning off with Series 2.
We just got the green light for season 2. our CMO purchased 10 more episodes. We'll be back.
It's invested. 10 more episodes.
Can't wait for it. Thank you, everybody. That will be us signing off for season 1, and we'll catch you for the start of season 2.
Thank you.
In Between Charges is a podcast from Monta, the charging software for all your EV needs. This podcast is produced by Rocio Fortuny, edited by Risto Dimitrov. Thanks for listening, everybody. If you want to keep up with the latest news about the show, follow Monta on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook. Happy charging.